Now, I promised this week I'm not going to go back and preach the whole Bible like I did last week or attempted to. But last week we saw that Gideon was weak because his faith was weak. We saw that this man was hiding in was it a wine press, and he was winnowing wheat. And that's something you typically don't do inside. And yet there he was hiding. Scripture even says because he didn't want to be seen or found by the Midianites, he wanted to be hiding away. And yet when the angel of the Lord came to him, he called him a mighty man of valor. And while in one sense I think it can be true that God was ribbing him a little bit, was saying, you mighty man of valor hiding here in the wine press. He was anything but valor, mighty or full of valor. And yet God was strong because God chose to work through Gideon. And so that made Gideon strong. He was a mighty man of valor because that's what God chose to use him for and to do through him. And we saw Gideon last week break down those altars that his father had built to the gods of the Midianites and Amalekites. And we saw that Gideon was in danger. His life was in danger because those Israelites of the city, the town, were looking for him, because who was it that tore these altars down? And we saw that his father, who had actually built those altars, it was his father's altars, Joash, ended up protecting him. And he gave this, I think, interesting response to those Israelites who wanted him killed. He said, if Baal wants to kill Gideon, he's a god, let him come and get him. And so Gideon then became known as Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend, or let Baal fight. And so he became, literally in his name, he became a reminder that Baal was powerless against God's mighty man of valor, even though if you were to look at Gideon, you wouldn't get valor, you wouldn't get might, just by his own looks. Well, we know someone else like that. I mentioned last week. Who else do we know like that? That if you looked at him, you would think he was this scrawny little teenager. Who was that? And yet God chose him. Who would that be? That would be David. Samuel went and he was looking for God's man, the man that was going to be anointed king to follow Saul in the kingship. And Samuel looked at each one, and here's my big strong son, and Samuel, no, it's not him. No, it's not him. Yeah, and you have any other sons? Well, I got David. He's just a boy. He's out there in the field with the sheep. Well, go get him. Yes, this is the man. This is the one God ordains. This is the mighty man of valor. And so that's what Gideon was, and his own name began to reflect this, Jerubbaal. And so as we begin chapter 7 this morning, we read, then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod, and the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. Now I should say we're in chapter 7, I believe, so I neglected to say that. But right here in this first verse, what do we see? Now you'll remember that last week we saw Gideon got all these people together. He went and he blew the trumpet. He got all these people together from all these different tribes, and they were all together here. In a little bit, we're going to see that there were a total of 32,000 people there. There was this big army. They were ready to go. I don't know what you've seen, but from what I've seen, soldiers are the most cocky, independent, capable people, men that there are. In fact, and I won't say the word, but I hope you know what I'm talking about. There was this picture or meme going around on the internet, back when, a long time ago, when we were sending soldiers over, to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there was this picture of all these soldiers lining the sides and the center of this huge airplane, and it was, have you ever seen a big can of whoop? And then you can fill in the blank there. And that was the can of, we're going to whoop your tail. And so soldiers are these ones, they're ready to go. And we even read that in the verse there. It's like, and the camp of Midian was north of them. And so they're set. They're ready to go fight. They're just ready to go. They're raring to go. Now, I don't know if you remember last week, one of the things we saw was that the Midianites and the Amalekites had, not only had they driven the Israelites up into the hill country in the north, into caves and all that, but all the way down to Gaza. So they were the whole length. And what did it say? What word did it use to tell us how many there were? It says they were like locusts. There were like myriad of myriads. There were so many. 32,000 of these soldiers isn't a lot. When you look at how many of the Midianites covering all of that land of Israel. And yet God said he was going to give them into Gideon's hand. Well, here are these soldiers, and they're ready to go. Then the Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into your hand. What? Too many? 32,000? And this like locusts enemy? Too many? I can't give them into your hand with this many. We don't need this many. We need fewer of them in order for me to give them over into your hand. Lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. God is saying, and you've all heard this before, you know what this is about. God is saying, I don't want to work with 32,000 of you, because if we're not careful, you'll get the idea that you did this, that you actually did this by your own strength and might. We read a little something like that in Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, where Paul writes to the Ephesians, for by grace are you saved, and that not of yourselves, it is not of works, lest any man should boast. God doesn't want us to see the grace that he performs in our lives and have any doubt that we had nothing to do with the grace that was exercised, the mercy that frees us from sin. Of course, that's not the direct analogy here, but I just find it interesting that the words are actually not that much different, lest the Israelites boast. So then God goes on in verse 3 and says, now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Now, these soldiers there, they all one up the other one. So, I think I'm strong because the next guy thinks he's strong. I got to be better than him. I got to be bigger and better and stronger and mightier and whatever. I got to be a better warrior than the next guy. But God says, if you actually are fearful and trembling, even though you're trying to pretend that you're ready to go to battle, maybe you should go home. And actually, not maybe. Let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. And right there, 22,000 of the people returned, and only 10,000 remained. So when it got down to brass tacks, we see that they weren't all that, mighty men of valor. Most of them ran away. And so now we look at that and we say, okay, 10,000 and myriads of myriads. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them there for you. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, and shall go, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And any one of whom I say, this one shall not go with you, shall not go with you. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Now this phrase laps, I think we picture a dog drinking as getting down and lapping up like that. But that's not what he's saying here. If we read on, we'll see what he actually was saying was that they take water in their hand and they lap it from their hand. That's what it's referring to. It's really the sound of the, and that distinct, you ever had a dog or been around, listened to a dog drink, that distinct sound of lapping. That's actually what it's actually referring to. But so that is those people you'll set by themselves. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. Okay, so separate them based on how they drink. And the number of those who lapped to drink water, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people knelt down to drink the water. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you. I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand. Let all the others go, every man to his home. And so the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets. So the people, now this is referring to the 300, took provisions, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, but retained the 300 men. And the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. We just read it was north, but below him in the valley, because most of the time the Bible writers are not thinking up and down in terms of north and south like we do when we look at a map. They're thinking of elevation. And so they were going down into the valley. The camp of Midian was down in the valley. And of course, we know that one of the analogies that's drawn, and I will just say, I don't know that this is necessarily valid, because there's not anything here that says why the Lord chose the ones that lapped from their hands. And we all know the reason that's given is because they were the ones that were alert, and God wanted soldiers that were alert. And that could perhaps be the reason. But I think that the main reason was because there were 300 of them. And they separated out. And so God says, that's the one I want, not because they're alert, but because there's only 300 of them. Because God's purpose here was to demonstrate that it was his power, his might, and not the Israelites. And so he needed the smaller group of people. Now we're down to 300, and we have these myriads of myriads. And I think that we can be pretty safe in saying that 300 men against such an army would be killed almost immediately were it not for God's intervention and God's power. And so that same night, verse 9, the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand. And notice that is a past tense. I have given it into your hand. It's as good as done. It's just like when Jesus was going to the cross, and when the victory was already won. Jesus had already accomplished, even though he had to go through those motions of actually dying on the cross. That was a very critical part of, it had to happen. He had to rise again. But in the scheme of things, in God's economy, in God's plan, it was as good as done. And so God says, I have given it into your hand. But if you were afraid to go down, why would God say that? Why would God think that Gideon might be afraid to go down? I mean, do you remember the guy back in the wine press? Do you remember the guy that brought the food and provisions to the angel of the Lord and set it out there and then saw it go up in fire? And then he said, okay, it's you. I'm on your side. We'll go. And then what did he do after that? He he brought out this fleece and he said, okay, I want you to make this happen. I want it to be all wet and the ground to be dry. And then that happened. And he didn't say, okay, let's go. No, he said, okay, I want you to do it again. But this time I want the fleece dry and the ground wet. I mean, this is just crazy. It's crazy how little. It's not that Gideon didn't know that it was God and that God wanted him to do this thing. Gideon just wanted to be he needed his confidence built up. And so the Lord says, if you're afraid to go down, if you're still having fears, and the thing is, God knew that Gideon was still having fears. You think God doesn't know that we are afraid? Do you think that God doesn't know that we hesitate to go knock on a door to talk to someone, or to answer a question with Scripture when we could just kind of pass it off sometimes? I mean, God knows. Sometimes it's not convenient for us. We're in a hurry. Or I'm not saying that we wouldn't be willing to talk about him, but the truth of the matter is, in our heart of hearts, even though we know God is real and we do trust him and we live like we trust him, there are times when we're fearful. And Gideon here, all the things he's been through and breaking down the altars and seeing how God protected him and all of those things and getting this army of people and, all of these things happening, and now Gideon is afraid. And God says, okay, if you're still afraid, go down to the camp with Purah, your servant. Go down to the Midianite camp. Sneak down there. Verse 11, and you shall hear what they say, and after your words your hands shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp, and the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. And when Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade. So Gideon was listening in. He was eavesdropping. And he said, behold, I dreamed a dream. And behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian, and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell down and turned it upside down, so that the tent lay flat. A barley cake fell down and broke the tent, just completely flattened it. And his comrade answered. This is the interesting part to me. His comrade answered, this is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. I find that so interesting. You remember back when Joseph was in prison in Egypt, and Pharaoh was dreaming dreams and wanted to have answers to it, and they couldn't tell what it was, and they tried to tell different things, but they really didn't know. And so Joseph, was called because he had interpreted somebody else's dream, and so Joseph came and interpreted the dream. Well, here we have a Midianite interpreting this dream. Somehow the Holy Spirit has revealed to this Midianite what this dream was about. And so Gideon gets to see this soldier here that we're going to go up to battle against knows that this not only is this the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel, but God has given him into the hand of Midian and all the camp. Let me read that correctly. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. God has given into Gideon's hand Midian and all the camp. It helps if we read the right words, doesn't it? These soldiers that they're about to fight against, at least this guy, already knows they're going to lose. And what do you think is going to happen? I mean, what do you think happens when a soldier believes that he's going to be beat? It lowers the morale. It means you're going to be ready to run. You're not going to be ready to fight. My wife and I went to a hockey game Friday night. Columbus Blue Jackets against the Washington Capitals. It started out to be a really good game. The Blue Jackets were completely dominating. They were all over the puck, both ends of the ice. Had more shots than the Capitals. They were doing really well. Capitals scored first, and then actually the Capitals scored 3 goals. And then Columbus scored a goal. So they were all, their morale is up. Then it comes and they got on first, I can't remember exact order. They scored another goal, but that goal was overturned by the refs. Something, I can't even remember what they did. They said, no, that's not a goal. So the morale was down. So it would have been 3-2. And the thing is, once you score, you have momentum. And then there was a check over on the other side of the ice. And you could say that his elbow hit the guy's face. This is very rare for them to do this. They don't call them that many of these, but they called a 5-minute major penalty. So once again, the refs got involved in the game and called a 5-minute major penalty against Columbus. And so here we are, 3-1. They just had a goal taken away from them that we thought was a valid goal. And then gets a 5-minute major. And with a 5-minute major, you go down 1 man. So it's on a 5-4. And it's for the entire 5 minutes. Normally with a penalty, it's a 2-minute penalty, not a 5-minute penalty. And if the other team scores, then the guy comes out of the box. So now we have 5 solid minutes. And after the penalty's over, there's about 2 minutes left in the game. So during the penalty, they score again. So now it's 4-1. And then after that, they scored again, and the guy hit it with a high stick into the. Oh, I know what happened before. I'm not going to go into it all, but he hit it with a high stick into the goal. The Capitals scored, and they were reviewing the play. And if the stick is above the crossbar when they hit it, it's not a goal. It's high stick. And it was close. I don't know for sure. It looked above the crossbar to me. I'm a little biased. And they called it a goal. And so the refs got involved in the game, and we lost 5-1. It was a pretty devastating loss. I mean, they wiped the floor, they wiped the ice with us, I should say. Anyway, morale was down. And so these guys here, these enemies of Israel, they knew they were going to have the dust, they were going to have the valley dusted with them. They knew they were just in trouble. And so as soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshiped. He worshiped. You'd think he would just get up and run back, let's go. No, he worshiped. That should be our response when we realize that God is active and involved in our lives and he's working out his plans. Our response should be to worship him. And what do we mean when we say worship? Well, fundamentally, we're giving him the glory. We're praising him. We're learning of him. We're studying his word. These are all parts of worship. We're giving to him. These are all parts of worship. And so Gideon worshiped. And, verse 15, he returned to the camp of Israel. And he said, "Arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand." And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies. And so now you have, how many is that? 300 divided by 3. You have 100 people. Maybe it wasn't exact, but 100 people in each group. I mean, they could have just been obliterated, couldn't they? 100 people against locusts in number. Just myriad of enemies they were fighting. He divided these 300 into 3 camps. And did he give them swords? Did he give them maybe bows and arrows? Did he give them armor? No. He put trumpets into the hands of all of them and empty jars. Now, how many hands does each soldier have? And what does he have in his hands? He's got a trumpet and an empty jar. Now, these were probably not, we're thinking glass jars, but it says with torches inside the jars. These were probably like pottery, okay? And maybe you'll see a candle in pottery, and obviously it can't be fully enclosed, but because it would go out because of the oxygen. But you know, they had them covered, and why did they have them covered? Why would they want them covered like that? So that you can't see them. They didn't want the enemy to see the candles. And so here they are. They've got these fire inside of these pottery jars with torches inside the jars in verse 17. And he said to them, look at me and do likewise. Follow me. This is the epitome of follow the leader. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me then blow the trumpets also on every side of the camp and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. They're going to blow trumpets and they're going to shout. Now, this is reminiscent of something that happened in the last generation. You remember what happened? Come on, somebody tell me what happened. It was a battle of, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. It was at Jericho. It was different. It wasn't exactly the same. There were trumpets involved. They walked around the city 7 times for 7 days. And on the 7th day, you know, they blew the trumpets and the walls tumbled down. Well, this is a little different. It's at night. They have candles in these pottery jars. And he says, you know, we're going to blow the trumpets. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him, remember there were 3 groups of 100 men, came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch when they had just set the watch. In other words, they had just changed their, Midian had people out there watching. And they blew their trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. And what do you think the Midianites would see if it was the dead of night and they, the first watch, it was dark, and they blew their trumpets and smashed the jars? What would they see? They would see this just, light all of a sudden, and they'd hear these trumpets. And what would they think? I think we're being attacked. Okay? And they cried out, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Sorry, I skipped a verse. See, we were talking about scribes copying earlier, and that's what happens. You skip. They blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. Verse 20. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hands the torches, and in their right hand the trumpets to blow, and they cried out. It actually would have been kind of hard to break those jars. If maybe they used the trumpet to break the jar, I don't know. They only had 2 hands. And cried out, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. In other words, Israel stayed there in their place. They didn't move. They didn't run. They didn't do anything. They stood there. They blew their trumpets, and they cried out. And then every man stood in his place around the camp. All the army ran. So the army of the Midianites ran. They were already, humiliated. They knew they were going to lose. The Lord had revealed that to them through this dream. They knew they were going to lose, and so they get up and they're just going. It's kind of like you ever see or hear of squirrels with their tails on fire? You know, you want to light up a place, that's the way to do it. They're going to be all over, and they're going to be, it's like tying cats' tails together and letting them go. And they're just crazy. So this army ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord had set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beth-shittah and toward Zererah, as far as the border of Abel-Molah and Tabbath. And the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and from Asher and from all Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. And so God used this crazy battle plan that we would never use. We would never send soldiers with trumpets and candles and jars. We just wouldn't do it that way. God used that to confuse the enemy and to create this chaos. And they killed themselves. They killed each other, their enemies. And when they, the few that finally figured out what was going on, they fled. And while they were fleeing, then the men of Israel called out of Naphtali and Asher and Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. It's interesting, though. I mean, I say that this is a crazy battle plan, and we would never do anything like that. But, they teach this at the military academy. They take these battles from the Old Testament, and they use these as examples for how we do battle. I'm not talking about literally exactly how they don't, get trumpets, but they take it and they say this was. It's kind of like, using propaganda, propaganda warfare, or during World War II, we had a bunch of tanks that were nothing but air, blown up tank. They literally, took and blew up these big balloons that looked like tanks, and they had them there so that the enemy would be confused and think there were tanks there. These kinds of things. People, keep our mouths shut. If you can keep the waters from flowing down if you dam it up so that they can't get to the water, or you guard so they can't get to the water. Against them as far as Barah and also the Jordan. And so all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the waters as far as Beth-barah and also the Jordan. And they captured the two princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. And they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb. I take it wasn't named that before, but it is now. And Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb, once again named after one who was killed there. It's interesting that it comes back to a wine press. Isn't that kind of just irony that God saw fit to put into this story where Gideon started out afraid and hiding in the wine press, and here Zeb was killed at a wine press? So the Israelites pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon across the Jordan to demonstrate their victory over these princes, these leaders of the army that they were fighting against. Well, it's not really hard for us to understand what are the applications to us today, but I obviously need to do that so that we can take this, instead of this just being an interesting story that we read, so we can take home with us something to help us this week. God works the impossible so that his plan, his power, cannot possibly be mistaken for something else. When those things happen that are totally unexplainable, that's God working. God is working things out. You know, God works things out. We saw it throughout the book of Acts. He works things out, and it is not always the way we would do it. In fact, I would venture to say it's almost never the way we would do it. God used persecution against Paul. He even used persecution against Saul to the death. He used the martyrdom of Saul. And all of these things, he used these things that we would think, oh no, we would just be all upset because these things are going on. Wouldn't we be upset if one of us was killed because of our faith, or someone that we knew was killed because of their faith? We would be upset. We really would be. It would cause fear in us. But we have to look at that and we have to say, God is using that. And I don't want to allude to this every week, but I'll just say, I don't know if you know anything that's been going on since Charlie Kirk was killed on September 10th, but there are people that are going to church. We don't see them here in our church. We have a very modest church. I'll say modest church. But there are people that are all across the nation that are going into Bible stores. I don't know if you know this, but they still do have Bible stores you can walk into. There are people going into Bible stores and they're buying more. They're saying the owners of the Bible stores are saying they're buying more Bibles than we've ever seen sold. All my friends are reading this. God is working. He's working in ways that we don't understand, in a way that we would never have designed. There are people who are coming to Christ because of Charlie's testimony. Now, Charlie was political, but through the years, he came to a point where he was almost non-political. I mean, he was political, but it was out of his belief, his faith. And he would basically go to these college campuses and say, prove me wrong, ask me anything, kind of thing. And they literally would, and they would come prepared. Now, he would come prepared, but he would have to be prepared for anything they might ask him. And he would go and his answers would almost always, toward the last few years of his life, would almost always come back to Jesus or come back to the Bible. Why do we do this? All of these hot button issues, I won't name any this morning because it would get me off on a tangent, and we don't have time for that. It wouldn't be beside the point too, but he would bring it back to Jesus. He would focus. Why do you believe this about politics? Because of Jesus. He would bring it back to the foundation. He was literally a master at doing that with no college education. But God is using his death. He uses the unlikely but the impossible to prove that it's his plan and his power, so we cannot possibly mistake it for anything other than God. Just as God gave Gideon a ability to go down and to hear that interpretation of that dream, sometimes God does give us a peek into his plan. I would say it's not very often, And I wouldn't say that it's the kind of thing that is prophecy or something like that, but sometimes he gives us a peek into what he's doing. Sometimes he lets us see some kind of a result that we wouldn't have otherwise seen. And he does that because we need to have our unbelief helped. You know, Lord, I believe, but help thou my unbelief. Yes, I believe, but it doesn't mean I don't have doubts. It doesn't mean I don't have fears. I need to have a peek into what you're doing. I need to have my confidence built up. It's not you. It's not God that is lacking when that happens. It's us that are lacking. And he gives us a peek to build us up, to help our unbelief. He gives us confidence. And most often he does that through reading his word and through prayer. And then something else we notice here, by just the way that Gideon went in with the trumpets and the jars with the torches or the candles, whatever it was, torches. God's plan isn't our plan. That's not the way we would do things. We would have gotten out the swords. It's just like David. When he went into battle and was gonna go up against Goliath, Saul wanted him in his armor. But the armor was clunky. It didn't work. David said, no, I go against bears and lions all the time. I mean, I don't know if David was nonchalant, but he certainly knew that God was going to be with him. It wasn't David's strength. It was God's strength. Yes, God had prepared him, but he didn't go in the typical way. He went in with a sling. And so here Gideon goes in with trumpets. His plan, God's plan, is not our plan. His ways are higher than ours. Isaiah 55, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1, but God chose what is foolish to the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. And isn't that what happened here? Gideon took 300 men and went up against this huge army that he couldn't even count. They didn't even give an estimate of the number that they were going up against. And he didn't go in with battle, weapons. They went in with trumpets. And God used this to cause the enemy to be confused and to kill each other. God uses a cross. God uses the death of his son. God uses the shed blood of Jesus to conquer sin. And then a resurrection of Jesus. Jesus raised from the dead to conquer death and the grave, to put God's stamp of approval on the punishment that he paid. See, we are weak, but he is strong. Just as the Lord delivered Midian into the hands of Gideon, in fact, he did it before they ever went into battle, as he said he had. God will accomplish his plan with our cooperation or in spite of us. We can either get on the train or we can get hit by the train. The train is God, by the way. It's time for us to get on the train. We don't know exactly how God's going to work. We don't know what he's going to do. We've been faithfully meeting here for many years. And we haven't lost a lot, but we've lost people. We don't have as many people as we had before, both through death and through people leaving. Just a small percentage, but it's a lot when you're a church this size, when you're a modest church like ours. We don't know what God's going to do. He could choose to grow this church. He may or may not. I'm not saying that I've got some insight. I don't have insight. I just know that he wants us to be faithful. He wants us to be faithful here, and he wants us to be faithful out there. And he will use our faithfulness in the way that he chooses to use it. He asks us or tells us in Peter to be ready always to give an answer for the hope that is in us with meekness and fear. And that means a couple different things. It means there better be hope in us. I don't mean, like I said at Mary's funeral, I don't mean I hope so kind of hope. I mean confidence. I mean assurance. We better have a hope. And frankly, we better have the hope of glory. And that hope better be something that people can see through the things we say and what we do. So that's number one, what Peter's saying is we better have a hope that shows up to people observing us. And number two, we better be ready always to give an answer for that hope. We better study to show ourselves approved, a workman that needs not to be ashamed, rightly dividing or discerning the word of truth. We better have a handle on it. We better know how to do that. That's part of why we're here, is to continually prepare, to continue hone our skills, our knowledge, our understanding. And the third thing that says is we better be ready to do that, to share that, to speak up to people. It is not always easy. Sometimes it's the hardest thing in the world to answer for what we believe and why. And the fourth thing that Peter says is that we need to do it with meekness and fear. And that doesn't mean be afraid. It doesn't mean like to be Gideon soldiers. It means to approach it with a respect, a understanding and a meekness, to understand these are people we're speaking with. We need to love them, and we need to speak in love with them, and we need to relate truth in a way that says, I love you enough to tell you the truth, even though it may not be interpreted that way. Just as the Lord delivered Midian into the hand of Gideon and those 300 men, God will accomplish his plan. And it'll probably be a plan that surprises us because we don't even know what the plan is. And his plan isn't our plan. It's not the way we would do things. So we can't be surprised at how he's going to go about accomplishing his will. We just know we need to be faithful.